Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Garrity.
And welcome, everyone, to the Monday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Dan Foster, contributing editor at National Review Online, in for Jim Garrity, who is off on the National Review cruise. I'm not even sure where they're cruising, but that's where he is. He'll be out all week. Dan is here all week. Those who are longtime Three Martini Lunch listeners know that Dan has done this before, and it's a thrill to have him back. Dan, it's good to be with you again.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Like George Foreman, after a long retirement, I'm trying to come back out and win another fight. So it's good to be back. I think it's been 5 or 6 years, so looking forward to it.
It has been. Well, and so if you're following the George Foreman analogy, I assume you have a very popular grill that will be introduced very soon as well.
It's still in the testing phases, but yeah, we're working on it. Paninis mainly.
All right. Well, as is often the case, as you and I were just commenting before we started recording here, whenever Jim is gone, there is massive news. And that is the case here as we start the week, and will be a big story certainly through the next few days as well. I don't know how much we'll touch on it in future days, but obviously the death late Friday of the 41st President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, at the age of 94, is the big political story. We're going to look at this today and go over his record, the good, the missed opportunities, and some of the crazy, which is a little more recent, and mainly how it's being covered in the mainstream press. But let's start with the good. We love to start with the good. George H.W. Bush, there's so many good things to say about him. Wonderful family man, great husband to Barbara for an amazing 73 years. It was obvious how much he adored his kids and his grandkids and how much he made that a priority. If you look at his service to our nation, beginning on his 18th birthday, signing up for the U.S. Navy, becoming the youngest Navy fighter pilot in World War II, at least for a time, to the point where he was shot down in 1944, very nearly lost his life, came home, did not rest in his wealthy family's reputation. Instead, he embarked out on his own to Texas, struck it big in the oil industry out there, and then turned to public service, lost a couple Senate races, but did win a couple of House terms. Then in the Nixon administration, UN ambassador, RNC chairman, liaison to China, CIA director, a job that he really wanted to stay on in the Carter administration, but was denied. Then, of course, he ran for president in 1980, lost the nomination to Ronald Reagan, but got on the ticket. He was Reagan's vice president for 8 years, and then, of course, won the presidency in his own right in 1988, lost it to Bill Clinton in 1992. We'll get to some of that in just a moment. As far as the biggest moments of the Bush presidency, Dan, that I think are worth celebrating today, first of all, the Gulf War was a time when a lot of people thought that we were heading into the next Vietnam because we hadn't had a major conflict since then, and a lot of people obviously had major reservations about that, but we got this moment in March of 1991, which was great for the entire nation.
As Commander-in-Chief, I can report to you our armed forces fought with honor and valor. And as President, I can report to the nation aggression is defeated, the war is over.
So there's a big win there. Then it was his State of the Union the next year, 1992, where he could report this.
But the biggest thing that has happened in the world, in my life, in our lives, is this. By the grace of God, America won the Cold War.
There might be some folks who think there were some remnants that still linger with us today, obviously, about communism, but he presided over the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and managed that quite well. And then on the domestic side, he stuck up staunchly for this guy.
This is a circus. It's a national disgrace. And from my standpoint, as a black American, as far as I'm concerned, it is a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks who in any way deign to think for themselves, to do for themselves, to have different ideas.
Obviously, Clarence Thomas, who was assaulted with the Anita Hill allegations, a Democratic Senate at that time. George H.W. Bush probably could have cut the cord if he wanted to. He didn't. He stuck with him, and he won that fight. And Clarence Thomas is now the senior longest-serving justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. So, Dan, that's just a few things in a very long and distinguished life. What stands out most to you with the life and career of George H.W. Bush on the good side?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of H.W. Bush, going all the way back to when I voted for him in my second grade mock election in 1992. I think he'll rightly be remembered as you sort of pointed out, as a foreign policy guy first, and as a human being, of course, as a character guy. And that's probably a fair assessment from a sort of political achievement perspective. But I think Bush is one of those guys who the compliments you pay to him are now a little bit out of style. So, for instance, I would say Bush, was a well-raised guy, a sort of noblesse oblige in the best sense of that word. Everyone who interacted with him or came across him has some story about his, grace, his charm, his politeness, his memory, his, care for other people. Class is, for lack of a better word. My own sort of highly attenuated Herbert Walker Bush story is my high school sweetheart. Her grandfather was a longtime doorman at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City. Something like 30 or 40 years he was the doorman there. And Bush lived there for just about a year or two when he was ambassador to the UN in the early 70s. And for 30 years after, my ex-girlfriend's grandfather got handwritten Christmas cards from George and Babs every year. Like I said, the class. I think what's unfortunately one of the, I guess, sort of bittersweet side effects of the passing of a great man like that is that you learn things about him you didn't know in his life. And for me, that, I'd known the story about how he was shot down over the Pacific, but I didn't know all of the really awful details. Came out many years later that the other men in his squadron who were shot down that day, and there were 10 of them, all of them died as Japanese prisoners of war, and some of them were eaten. That's right. They were eaten by the Japanese. So he floated, sort of bobbed in the ocean for a while, and it was said that when the USS Finback, I think it was the sub that rescued him, when the Finback surfaced, he thought he was hallucinating. This was in Stu Stevens' remembrance of Bush. He said he only said 4 words when he was pulled aboard. He said, "Happy to be on board." And I won't do the impression, but everyone knows what that sounds like in George Bush's voice.
Exactly. Happy to be on board. Man.
Not too bad.
It was better when I was in high school. Everyone's got a personal touch, and I can't imagine how many Christmas cards they had to write, given how many friends they had. He came to my hometown, Iron Mountain, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the summer of 1986 to stump for our Republican congressman who was up for re-election in a tough midterm year. Greeted the local officials on the tarmac, and then against the protocol, since we had never been screened, those of us along the airport fence, he insisted on coming over to shake our hand. So a quick moment there, obviously something that would be unlikely to happen now without having gone through the scanner. But a good guy and a consequential figure. A lot of people have said a very consequential 4 years as well. And that is certainly true, given what went on in the world at that time. And unfortunately, some things that went on domestically as well as we transition to our bad martini now, because from a conservative standpoint, you could at least call them missed opportunities, sometimes just downright mistakes. And I'm going to focus on 2. Other folks might focus on a couple other things here. We mentioned him sticking by Clarence Thomas, who ended up being one of the great conservative rocks on the Supreme Court. His first Supreme Court vacancy, however, occurred in 1990 in his second year in office, and it was the first Supreme Court vacancy since the turmoil of the Robert Bork confirmation process, in which Bork was not confirmed. Then there was Ginsburg, not Ruth Bader, but a different one who was never even given a confirmation hearing or vote because he had actually smoked pot back in the 60s. Don't think that would probably derail you anymore. Then it was Anthony Kennedy, who obviously made it onto the court. So Bush was trying to make sure he didn't have a guy with a long track record that the Democratic majority could assail. So he came up with a guy, probably through John Sununu and Senator Rudman, named David Souter, who they said the Democrats probably can't track down and nail as a conservative that they could sink in a confirmation vote. Well, they found a guy they couldn't target as a conservative, and he got confirmed anyway. Here's what Bush actually said the day that Souter was sworn in.
During the recent hearings, Justice Souter clearly demonstrated the superb education, training, and experience that grace his record. But even more important, he once again demonstrated his lifelong devotion to principle, a simple, straightforward, and enduring principle, a principle quite familiar to Justice James Wilson and the other framers of the Constitution. And the principle is this: the role assigned to judges in our system is to interpret the Constitution and lesser laws and not to make them.
Not really sure David Souter stuck to that over his 19 years on the court. A very reliable liberal. And on a lot of cases, you can go from Planned Parenthood v. Casey to a lot of others over the years, including eminent domain and several others that have long-lasting impacts in the wrong direction from the way our founders probably would have intended. As far as the most famous mistakes, here's how that one started. This isn't the mistake. It's what happened later.
My opponent won't rule out raising taxes, but I will, and the Congress will push me to raise taxes, and I'll say no. And they'll push, and I'll say no. And they'll push again, and I'll say to them, read my lips. No new taxes.
So fast forward to 1990. The Democrats are playing hardball on the budget. President Bush agrees to a tax increase, and probably is the reason Ross Perot got in the race, and is probably the reason he lost re-election. And you could say that ultimately led to a quarter century and counting of the Clintons in our lives. So, Dan, when it comes to conservative missed opportunities, what comes to mind?
Well, yeah, I think on Souter, it's tough to really blame Bush because, as you pointed out, Bork sort of started a lot of changes in the way that judges are nominated, but also the way the judiciary handles itself, the way ambitious young judges who think they might one day sit on a circuit court of appeals or even the Supreme Court conduct themselves in their writing and their jurisprudence. Bork really initiated all of that, and let's not forget the Federalist Society had been around for about a decade at this point, but it wasn't the force that it is now. And Souter was in many ways kind of the last mistake. We haven't seen a justice that swung as wildly from the sort of principles of the president who appointed him since then. And I doubt we will, at least not to that extent. I mean, Stevens was another example of a justice who, swung wildly from the principles of the president who appointed him. But the revolution inaugurated by Bork and by Souter changed judicial politics a lot. And, the way Mitch McConnell conducts judicial nominees now, along with the president and the White House, is what it is because of, those Bush years and the late Reagan years. So on that one, I think it's a little unfair to blame him. On the tax increase, I'm of two minds about that. I mean, on the one hand, it was bad, and shouldn't have happened. On the other, it's a character thing for Bush, and he owned up to breaking his pledge. He stood by it for the most part, even if he understood and regretted that it, probably cost him in 92. The thing that sticks out to me about that is, and I think we'll get into this in the Crazy Martini, as my friend Jeremy Senderowitz points out in a great thread on Twitter, it's in my feed this morning if people want to check it out, that the press both agreed with Bush on principle, that is to say, they agreed with the Democrats and they liked the tax hike, but savaged Bush for breaking his pledge in coverage heading into 1992. So they, as is their wont, they tried to have both ways. Something that they agreed with him on the merits, they also used as a cudgel to trash him as a hypocrite.
Dan, let's get to the media coverage of the passing of President Bush here. It's interesting revisionist history here in a lot of different ways. They are extolling him for his character, which is obviously accurate. They're extolling him for his mature leadership in the world. Some of it's designed to contrast that with President Trump and, let's just say, his less genteel way of dealing with critics and the media and pretty much life in general. And so they like to paint that comparison. But if you go back to the 1990s, as you said, even though they agreed with him on the tax cut, they savaged him for it at the time. Now they're saying it's a moment of fantastic political courage because they liked it. They hated the Gulf War and the build-up to the Gulf War. They had the no blood for oil chants going on and that sort of thing. And now they're talking about how he was able to build a coalition and was able to get along with our friends and even some of our non-friends in the world to help make that happen. And so it's just fascinating to watch that. Then there's the Associated Press. This got a lot of attention because it was right after the news came out that he had died. George H.W. Bush, they wrote in a tweet, a patrician New Englander whose presidency soared with the coalition victory over Iraq and Kuwait, but then plummeted in the throes of a weak economy that led voters to turn him out of office after a single term, has died. He was 94. They eventually pulled the tweet because they said it failed to mention the fact that he was a World War II veteran. So, Dan, I don't know if you're more offended with the run-on sentence in that tweet or the fact that it was just kind of an ugly smear job in how they first presented the fact that Bush had died.
Well, what's interesting is it's either insincere or they're utterly blind and blinkered, because breaking news, folks, it isn't like they wrote that tweet as soon as they got the word from Texas that the president had passed. Right. I mean, that tweet was written 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So what you're seeing is kind of an accurate portrayal of what sticks in the mind of, at least a handful of editors at the Associated Press. But yeah, I mean, what's sort of bugged me about the remembrances is as nice as it has been to be reminded of some things that I hadn't thought about, or to learn new things about the president, as I said earlier, every thought that exists in the media space today has to be in relation to the president of the United States. So it has to be processed through Donald Trump. And so even, it's like I mentioned, Stuart Stevens' nice remembrance of Bush, that's all about how Bush is unlike the current president. Maureen Dowd has a long remembrance that I'll just say is very Maureen Dowdy. It's maximum Dowd, but there's some nice, anecdotes and thoughts about the president there too. But of course, everything is contrasted with Orange Man Bad. So it's a little frustrating that there can't, people seem incapable of, processing a single political thought without worrying about or pontificating on how it relates to the current occupant of the Oval Office.
It's exhausting. I realize that every news story, regardless of whether it's initially related to Trump or not, ends up being about Trump some way, which is kind of exhausting. But in this situation, the fact that you can't just set it aside and talk about the legacy of this guy, because I'm pretty sure Donald Trump was making cameo appearances in Home Alone 2 during the Bush administration. I'm not sure that really needs to be tied into what's going on now. But
he's like, I would say he's like a black hole, except the media are all pointing their spaceships right at it. Everything sort of gravitates to him because he tends to make things about him, but they're aiding and abetting by heading at warp 9 right to the event horizon.
Exactly. Now, here's the question. How old do you feel watching some of these old clips? And not just because it was a long time ago. I mean, he was elected 30 years ago, and he was vice president 38 years ago, practically. But the difference now between anything recorded in standard def versus high def. So when you look back at the standard def, it just makes you feel ancient.
When my mom tells me a story, when I was 3 or 4 years old, I asked her if the world used to be in black and white. And I think kids born in the next decade will probably ask their parents if the world used to be in 480p. Oh, I did want to say one more thing in the Crazy Martini, because I never miss an opportunity to knock the guy. But I hadn't realized that the reporter who basically made up from whole cloth the whole supermarket cash register thing that Bush was excoriated for, that was Andrew Rosenthal, who went on to be the longtime editorial page director at the New York Times. And, for my money, really bad at his job there. But I didn't realize he not only did he, essentially make up that smear, he wasn't there to witness it. So he wrote a news story from a sort of White House pool write-up or something like that. And it included all of these, adjectives about the, look of shock on the president's face, and he wasn't even there. So an early indication of the kind of editorial page director he would become.
I don't know if you subscribe to this, Dan, but there's a line out there in some conservative circles that the only conservatives or Republicans the media love are the retired ones, and especially the deceased ones.
Absolutely.
That's pretty much right.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's a strange new respect, right? If that wasn't invented for Bush, it could have been.
I'm sure we'll be talking about different aspects of this in the days to come. As we've been recording here, they've been loading up the plane in Texas with all the members of the Bush family, as well as, of course, the remains of President Bush. He'll be going on to the U.S. Capitol later today and lying in state there, or lying in honor, however they're going to phrase it. I believe till Wednesday morning they'll have the major service at National Cathedral, and then final services and interment on Thursday down in Texas. So, Dan, I'm sure there'll be other stories along the week, but certainly appropriate to pause and reflect on the Bush legacy today, as well as the media's handling of him then and now. But good to be with you as always, and I look forward to chatting with you tomorrow.
Thanks, Greg.
Daniel Foster, contributing editor at National Review Online. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today, and tune in again on Tuesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.